The Gospel of Matthew is often thought of as a Christian text because it's found in the New Testament. It's in the Christian canon. But Dr. Anders Runesson of the University of Oslo in Norway, he argues that the Gospel of Matthew is actually a Jewish text. How did he come to this conclusion? That's what we'll talk about here today on Bible History. Dr. Runesson received his PhD from Lund University, and currently he is professor of New Testament at the University of Oslo. His research interests are in Matthew's Gospel, Paul, the historical Jesus, ancient synagogues, Jewish-Christian relations, Jewish-Christian and Greco-Roman mission, as well as translation, terminology, epistemology, and methodology. Along with many academic accomplishments, he has also completed the 10 to 12 mile obstacle course designed for the British Special Forces called the Tougher Mudder Race. In Dr. Runesson's article, Saving the Lost Sheep of the House of Israel, Purity, Forgiveness, and Synagogues in the Gospel of Matthew, he points out that the theological themes in Matthew can only be understood when they are read in their Jewish context, and he specifically focuses on first-century synagogues to make this point. The Gospels are often approached with a certain assumption that during the first century there were two separate and distinct religions, where church was associated with Christianity and synagogue was associated with Judaism. But as Dr. Runesson points out, this is just not an accurate picture of the first century. The non-Jewish religion we know today as Christianity, that religion did not exist in the first century. In fact, the Greek word ekklesia, which is commonly translated as church, was not at all disconnected from the synagogue during the first century. The simple meaning of that word is assembly, and it was used by Jews during this time to refer to both the public and association synagogues. According to Dr. Runesson, public synagogues were much like a city hall. He goes on to explain that they were the place where decisions were made regarding all things local. Archives were kept there, judicial proceedings took place there, and since in antiquity people did not distinguish between the secular and the religious, the Torah was read and discussed publicly on Sabbaths. Its architecture would best be compared to the British Parliament. It was designed for debate. The focal point was the Torah at the center of the room, and on Shabbat it was read and discussed. No Jewish group stood as the leaders, not even the Pharisees. However, Dr. Runesson argues that the scribes probably dominated the interpretation of the text. Now, what about an association synagogue? Well, this was not a building. Rather, it was a Jewish group or community that welcomed God-fearers, non-Jews who were interested in Judaism. Dr. Runesson points to a number of scholars who argue that the Jewish sects from Qumran were examples of these association synagogues. The way the New Testament Gospels use the Greek word ekklesia, again the word commonly translated as church, it is used to refer to an association synagogue, specifically a community of believers in Jesus. With all this in mind, let's turn to the Gospel of Matthew and explore the function of the public and association synagogue. The public synagogue was the place where Jesus taught. It was the place where he fought against misinterpretations of the Torah, which risked the Jewish people from facing God's judgment. It was the place where Jesus fought against evil that manifested itself in the form of sickness and disease. In Matthew 10:17, Jesus warns his followers that they will be flogged in these public synagogues. And this is all evidence that Jesus and his followers were deeply involved in Jewish society. Like the Jewish sects from Qumran, those association synagogues, Jesus and his association synagogue, the Ecclesia, were attempting to remodel Jewish society in order to bring it in line with God's will. The difference was the method. So while the Qumran sect secluded themselves from Jewish society, Jesus and his Ecclesia, his association synagogue, were engaging in Jewish society, specifically the public synagogue. This is the place where they were attempting to save Israel from the scribal leaders who they saw as having abandoned and abused the Jewish people, the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And this is why Dr. Runesson calls the public synagogue the battlefield where this was done. The most important thing to understand about the ecclesia, according to Matthew, is the need for ritual and moral purity. And Dr. Runesson makes the point that the only institution that Matthew explicitly describes as holy is the Jerusalem temple and the altar. One of the worst forms of defilement in Judaism is bloodshed. And this is what happens at the hands of the leaders in the temple in Matthew 23. As a result, God leaves the temple as he left the first temple before its destruction. In Matthew, Jesus, who is God's Messiah, leaves the temple and goes to the Mount of Olives. That is the same place where Ezekiel says God's glory remained after he left the first temple. The high priest and the elders of Jerusalem send Jesus to be executed by Rome, and he is killed. And in Matthew 27, verse 51, it says, "At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom." Dr. Runesson points out that according to Matthew's theology, God established the Mosaic covenant with the Jewish people, with Israel, so that his presence would be among them. And included in the Mosaic law was atonement, which functioned through sacrifices in the Jerusalem temple. And as long as God's presence was in the temple could not be destroyed. But when the temple was defiled, that caused a major problem. God's holiness prevented him from living in the defiled temple. And this, coupled with the fact that the temple would eventually be destroyed, which would strip Israel from receiving atonement, breaking down the Mosaic covenant that God established with Israel, is the reason why Jesus needed to come and die. Through his death, he saves Israel from their sin and restores the Mosaic covenant. Dr. Runesson makes the brilliant observation. Christian thinkers have often construed the destruction of the temple as God's punishment for the death of Jesus. From Matthew's perspective, however, it is the other way around. Because the temple will be destroyed, based on the fact that it has already been defiled, Jesus has to sacrifice himself to save his people. The temple is still holy, but now it is defiled. So where did God's presence go? Well, according to Matthew, after Jesus' death, Jesus rose from the dead. The resurrected Jesus is the embodiment of God's presence, what the Hebrew Bible calls the Shekinah. And God's presence cannot coexist with moral defilement. So if someone wants to live in God's presence, they have to receive forgiveness from God. But in order to receive forgiveness from God, that person must first be reconciled to others. They must first forgive other people. The ecclesia is where atonement is provided. It's where the Mosaic covenant is restored. It's the place where God's presence, the resurrected Jesus, resides, and it is the institution that provides the correct way of keeping the Mosaic law. Dr. Runesson goes on to explain that members of the ecclesia anticipate a restored Israel in a recreated world, which is headed by their Messiah and the 12 apostles, representing the 12 tribes. In this world, which will also consist of non-Jews who have joined them, the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. So again, is the Gospel of Matthew a Christian text? Well, according to Dr. Runesson, the answer is no. It is a Jewish text, and its theology can only be understood within first century Judaism. Dr. Runesson concludes this article by making some important points concerning the significance and implications of his arguments. Such historical results may cause some anxiety among modern mainstream Christian and Jewish communities, since they tend to blur the boundaries that were established between these religions in late antiquity, and which have since, by and large, remained in place. The historian's task is, however, not to confirm later normative developments, but to search for voices and landscapes that have been lost. These voices may not always suit our contemporary narratives and claims. They may even challenge them. But the hermeneutical burden of making them useful today, regardless of what we mean by useful, lies, after all, not with the ancients, but with us. We must resist, as historians, the temptation to colonize the past with our own perspectives, which in the end can do little more than serve our own identity needs. I find Dr. Runesson's arguments persuasive, but I really want to know what you think, so please let me know in the comments, whether you agree, whether you disagree. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and thank you for joining me here today on Bible History.